My name is Ken Wissaker, and I'm the Senior Executive Editor at Duke University Press. And I'm very excited to be here today with my friend and author, Vanessa Díaz, an anthropologist, ethnographer, journalist, whose work on race, gender, and labor, popular culture across the Americas, and who has a brand new book, Manufacturing Celebrity, Latino Paparazzi and Women Reporters in Hollywood, just out. She started her career very early on, and I hope we can talk about this, as a stringer for People magazine and then working through it. And this ethnography is really pioneering in many, many ways in Latinx studies and in anthropology, but also in what's kind of been called for a long time the ethnography of production. So ethnography of production partly came out of film and media studies. And in the beginning, it was thought like, oh, there's an auteur theory, one director on a film, but lots of people work on the film. And one of the things that Vanessa's book does, is to expand who we think about as manufacturing in Hollywood. And the book starts really with two basic stories. And I wonder, Vanessa, if you might start by telling us a little bit about both, about Chris Guerra, a Latinx paparazzi photographer, and Natasha Stoyanov, a white female reporter for People magazine.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Ken. Thanks for the introduction. It's been a long road to get here. But yes, I do start with those two stories because for me, Chris and Natasha sort of encapsulate really what you were just talking about, who we envision as the people who are media producers, who are viewed and valued as media producers, or in their cases, undervalued or not valued at all, perhaps. So Chris was a young paparazzo who I started working with during the course of my fieldwork, sort of when I thought I was finishing my fieldwork. And then all of a sudden it was like, oh no, this is sort of just the beginning. In fact, I met him just before you and I met at the Ford conferences, actually. And he was training with one of the other paparazzi who I had been working with regularly throughout the course of my fieldwork. He had just moved to LA, and I ended up taking what turned out to be some of the last photos of him ever, because he was killed on New Year's Day, January 1st, 2013, while he was trying to photograph Justin Bieber. And the details around his death were really murky. The investigation was really poorly handled. No one was ever charged. He was hit and killed by two different cars. There was no attempt to revive, even though the officers who were on the scene were trained in CPR. As they exited the scene, they were recorded on the dash cam footage calling him an effing idiot. And this all came about as he had been working on covering Justin Bieber. That was kind of his beat, so to speak. Paparazzo work comes with, also having a beat like other journalists would. So he was covering Justin Bieber that day, had friendly interactions with him earlier that day. And when Justin Bieber's Ferrari was stopped, Chris stopped to photograph the stop. And the people in Justin Bieber's car, to this day, we still don't know who was in the car, basically told the cops, like, why are you bothering us? You should be looking at that photographer over there. Cop turned his attention to Chris and began to sort of deride him as he stood next to a really busy road that runs almost like a highway here in LA. And we don't know if he fell backwards. They claim that he ran into the street to get back to his car because the cop was sort of threatening him. But he died tragically, and in the wake of his death, there was just continued sort of derision of him as a paparazzo, right? Paparazzi are hated in Hollywood, despite the fact that the magazines rely on their images and that the whole culture of celebrity relies on these images. So that was sort of one side where, one of the things I talk about in the book is over the course of the sort of earlier 2000s that we see this demographic shift in paparazzi from mostly white men to mostly Latinx identified men. And so there's this correlation of increased hatred towards the paparazzi and increased racialization and increased policing and increased anti-paparazzi legislation. So that was this one side of when I think about, celebrity magazines is the paparazzi images. And this is how the paparazzi are treated. And then on the other side, the story that I talk about, Natasha Stoyanov, who, her story is much more well known now because in 2016, just prior to the election, she came forward with her story, which is now resurfacing again, that President Donald Trump, before he was president, sexually assaulted her while she was reporting for People magazine. She was one of my mentors at the magazine when I started as an intern in 2004. And in 2005, she was sexually assaulted by him. She first confided in me about this while I was doing my research in 2011 and 2012. It's recorded. And she asked, of course, for it to be anonymous at the time. And, while coming from a completely different demographic, class-wise, race-wise, gender-wise, she represented this other part of what it takes to manufacture celebrity and who is actually doing the work and who is actually suffering doing the work. So even though she was in a very different position, she's very cognizant of the fact that her position as, a middle class, upper middle class white woman, college educated, working for the magazine was a very different position than a working class man of color who was working freelance and in a more precarious position. They still both were treated as disposable and undervalued by the very system that relies on their labor. And so that's why I chose to open with those two stories, because I think they really encapsulate what's at stake here and why this book and why these stories are so important to us understanding the power structures of Hollywood.
It's really a story of our time. This morning I was thinking about the book and thinking about adjunctification. And you have people doing the kind of work without which something can't go on, but at the same time, their disposability is built into the structure. And the way you bring that out in these two different groups of people engaged in really building star culture is really comes through very strongly in the book.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point, because part of what I'm trying to underscore in the book and what I'm underscoring in the conversations I'm having now about the book is that the reason I talk about the Hollywood system as an industrial complex, I call it the Hollywood industrial complex, because as we reckon with the different systemic issues, systemic violences, systemic racism that are inherent in all institutions, we can't ignore the role that Hollywood plays in that. We can't ignore the fact that Hollywood has always been one of the, since its inception, this extremely large, powerful cultural force and institutional force in the US that has promoted and relied on the promotion of racist stereotypes, sexist stereotypes, and has really been about maintaining the power structures in this country that have gotten us to the present moment. So I think it is just like we're reckoning with all these other institutional forces, that this is a moment to reckon with the institutional forces of Hollywood as well.
And in your own life, here you are teaching in LA at Loyola Marymount. I've heard you say you were kind of born into the culture because you were an LA kid. Right. And so it's kind of interesting to think about something that you grow up in and then are able to write about. I really want you to hear about Starbucks and NYU and how you first got involved in thinking about this as something you could participate in and think about at the same time, even though perhaps that goes the whole lifetime.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. It's definitely, and I talk about that in the introduction to the book too, right? How, my family's relationship to Hollywood, my father was an activist, but he was also a musician who, was aspiring in many ways, toured with big artists and hoped for the big break. I've seen my siblings go through that, the feeling of the connection that people have, I think, really across the country, but especially concentrated in LA to, Hollywood's right there. It's right within our grip. We just kind of have to grab hold, is something that I very much grew up with. I certainly had an affinity for, if not obsession with, stardom and celebrity. But that transitioned as I got older and became more into sort of activism. And then when I was at NYU, I, had this opportunity that I really was not thinking about wanting to be a celebrity journalist at all. It was sort of, I got into a casual conversation at the Unity Journalists of Color conference in the summer of 2004 with one of the editors of People magazine. And I was not at all interested in a job. And then I saw an ad come out that fall because I was a journalism minor. They were looking for paid interns from NYU. And I worked throughout all of college. And so I said, well, here's another job I could apply for. And I have a contact there. So I applied and they hired me initially. My primary role was to kind of follow the Olsen twins because they were students at NYU. And then, shortly after I started getting assigned to red carpet events and other kinds of special interviews and events and premieres and, really taking it all in. And I think that when I certainly didn't imagine doing this book or pursuing this research at that time. But what I did know immediately was that everything I was seeing was really important. And that I was keenly aware of the gender dynamics and the racial dynamics that make up the crux of the book. And I saw that from day one in the People magazine offices, on the red carpet, in my interactions with celebrities. And so I was always taking note. And I think in the beginning, it was probably more of what, like, now after, attending a PhD program in anthropology, I would think of as, like, in the beginning, it was maybe more like, Laura Nader's famous essay on studying up. And I felt like I was sort of studying up, looking at celebrity and these people who were kind of like above me. And then it shifted as I not only became a reporter and was more part of the community, but also working with people who, like the paparazzi, who felt like, no, in fact, I was kind of a threat to them in certain ways. But it was certainly an evolution. And I think it took, I know you and I were both in attendance at this panel recently, The Case for Letting Anthropology Burn, where this critique of anthropology that is ongoing, around the sort of tendencies to think that we have to be removed from the work, I felt that initially too. And so I had been told by numerous people that I shouldn't pursue research in LA because I grew up here. I shouldn't pursue research in Puerto Rico because I was Puerto Rican and spent a lot of time there. And that the only viable project of my options was ongoing research in Cuba I had been doing. And I'm so grateful that I was able to get the support and the gumption to say no to that. And to
bad advice.
Yeah. And to say there are incredibly important things that we have when we have access. And that's really, it's a question that comes up here. It's a question that comes up in the work of Sherry Ortner and several other people who have tried to do work in Hollywood. If you have access, you need to use that access. If you have a relationship to a material, you need to engage with that connection. And so I just feel really fortunate to, have started this path not thinking that this would be the work that would result. And now, I remember the same woman who I met at that conference who gave me the opportunity to join People when I first went into the PhD program. She said, I just don't understand the connection. Like, why did you work at People and now you're doing this? And I told her, and this was before I knew I would write this book, I said, well, to me, I'm still studying popular culture. That's always my area. I'm still interviewing people. I'm asking questions. It feels connected to me. And now I think that everyone can see why it was so important for me to have had that time as a reporter.
One of the really deft things I think you do as an author is move from the racialization and racism and gender production and sexism in the industry among the people who work there, and the way body regulation, both in terms of racialization and gender and shape and size and color, is produced through Hollywood. And one of the best sections is where there are all these covers of people in a row, and the kind of production of continual unsettledness about that. And I wonder if you might want to talk about that a little.
Yeah. I think that section, the body teams chapter, it's part of the reason I think it's really important is what you pointed to, which is the imagery, which I think for many people, the book is, the images are so important. This is such a visual topic, and having the ability to see those images and to see it's like an evolution, but it's also so static. And that becomes so apparent when you get to see the visuals and not just the description. And part of, what, again, I say, like, I have this access. Most people are simply not aware of the fact that these magazines have teams dedicated to interrogating the body. And as you said, when you think about race, when you think about gender, we think about the body and the role that the body plays, the way the body is policed. And essentially these teams at these magazines are a team policing bodies, right? And the impact that has on the producers of this media is something that we certainly don't have sort of insider knowledge about. And that was one of the things I was most struck by too, is that the women of color who were on those teams, and in many cases, I don't even identify necessarily the sort of racial identification, because there are so few that it would tell everyone who said that, because there are so few people, but it really tore people down, right? Like the process of being paid to police bodies in ways that have direct correlation to racist assessments of beauty, to Eurocentric assessments of beauty, impact everyone who's involved, but impact, the African American and Latinx women who are on these teams, who understand not only are they producing this, predominantly white publication that, I talk in the beginning of the book that the celebrities say, this is white people magazine. But that they're also tearing down themselves in the process. And so there's this really complicated dynamic that I think emerges in many of the different sections, but particularly in this one, around the question of the identity of the reporters and the material that's being produced. And I think that's a moment where, for me, this question of coming together of production studies and sort of more traditional media studies is really important, because we don't have as many studies of production as we do of consumption or sort of content analysis. But when we can bring those things together, you can really see the full circle effect, not just on the communities that the material reaches, but on the communities who are producing the material as well.
One thing that's really fascinated me, so perhaps this is, I hope other people will be fascinated too. When you're telling the story about Natasha, you talk about how People was going to run with this, and then before Trump was elected, and then gave it some publicity. And as soon as he was elected, they were like, no, now I got my front row seat for the inauguration, as if like we're moving. And so you have an industry that's both like, we're going to set the trend, we're going to tell you how thin you should be, or like maybe you're too thin, or maybe you've gotten to try and take off your pregnancy pounds too quickly. We're going to try and set an agenda, but then also must feel like, oh, we're always scampering to keep up with the news. And how you see that dynamic of like setting and reacting in magazines that have to come out every week and always have to seem like right there.
Right. I mean, what you just outlined is right. The bottom line is that this is a money-making machine, right? This is a capitalist endeavor, and the idea is that this will make money. And so, if we start with, what you mentioned first, Natasha's story, I think that the magazines, not only was there perhaps a part of them that wanted to sort of defend themselves because they didn't feel that they had the knowledge of the full scope of the story, because they didn't, right? Because Natasha had not come forward with all the details officially to the magazine until that point. So there was a part of it where they were, I think, doing the due diligence of saying, okay, this happened sort of under our watch, so to speak, and we're going to address it, and we're going to condemn the behavior. We're going to honor the story of our employee or former employee. But again, the jump happens if the perception is that, well, Trump's the president now and therefore is popular, right? Even if it was a contentious election, he was, he was the president. And so the perception was that now we will serve that audience because that's the majority audience. And so we're going to turn it over and make this all happy, fun coverage. I think that you see the sort of audacity of that when the very editor who had been the sort of talking head on behalf of Natasha on all media, talking about how terrible what happened to Natasha was the very same editor who was then photographed hugging Trump at his inaugural party on election night. And so I know
that's a between men story.
Right. It was, I think, the level of sort of insult to injury that kind of encapsulated really goes back to this larger question about where, not just allegiances, but priorities, right? And the priority is money. And so what the magazines have found is that the body covers, the who lost the most weight, the who gained it back the fastest, these cycles, they sell incredibly well, right? And now at a time where there's the ability to sort of catalog and track clicks in a way that there wasn't before, from the start of the magazine in the 70s to now, there's a way to tabulate what people are clicking on in real time. And that drives ultimately what, the kinds of decisions. Of course, this goes back to the very earliest kinds of thinking about media, like what comes first, is it the producers or is it the consumers? And I think, of course, it's both. And I think this is where the institutional question becomes so important, where obviously we understand media is for profit. This particular media is for profit, especially. However, as an institution, they do have the ability to make shifts. Hollywood as an industrial complex and these magazines as institutions make choices. And those choices end up impacting the kinds of material we get, whether we want to attribute it to consumer clicks or not.
So over the course that you were writing the book, we had a huge amount of Latinx persecution by the aforementioned president and those who would like to carry out that work. And we also had, it's sort of funny to call this a movement, but the Me Too moment, extended moment, continuing, hopefully. And so I wonder how you think about how things have changed, especially over the last 4 or 5 years as you were writing the book, both with the Latinx community and especially the men, mostly men who you, are there, I can't remember if there are any Latina photographers or it's all guys.
There are a few.
Uh-huh.
There are a couple of women photographers, but they, who I met throughout the course of my work, but who were not interested in collaborating on the research.
Mm-hmm.
But it's really just a few.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, the moments that you're talking about. So I think there's so many layers here and questions about representations in all different kinds of ways. The Me Too movement emerged while I was doing this work. Oscars So White emerged while I'm doing this work. So all of these kinds of important calling out about particular kinds of injustice. And of course, the Me Too movement, not necessarily starting in Hollywood at all, but became so prominent there because of abuse of power and because of the fact that, you have these very power dynamics that I'm talking about in the book playing out at all different levels. And so I think, still for journalists, there's been some little moments of kind of addressing Me Too. But, for someone like Natasha, the connection to Trump is actually what kind of enabled her to be sort of applicable to that moment because it became so celebrity oriented. And so I think that all of these moments of calling out and, hashtags and these sort of movements are really important in terms of drawing out these power dynamics, but they're certainly not exhaustive of the kinds of injustices that we're seeing. Right. And I think, with the question of sort of Latinx persecution, policing, detention, the show your papers law, all of these different things that are happening throughout the course of my research, those simply didn't get the same kind of traction. And I think this goes back to, where we started with Chris and Natasha's story and why their sort of intersectional identities had such different ramifications. So that even if Natasha she has certainly not received justice, right? She has to look at her assailant on television constantly. He's the president of this country. And that breaks her and the other victims every day. They don't want to see him or say his name, right? And yet on the flip side, there has been some vindication in the sense that she has had her story told and she has had her story heard. Now, Chris Guerra and his family have received nothing. In the wake of his death, not only did celebrities continue to focus only on Justin Bieber and his well-being, and people like Miley Cyrus saying, oh, we need to focus on Justin, poor Justin. This is terrible that this is on his conscience. His family should have taught Chris not to play in the street, all these terrible things. And yet, and again, I always point to this. I point to this in the book, and I've pointed to it in conversations. Chris's mother is an African-American woman. His father is Mexican. So to have Miley Cyrus, this privileged, rich, white celebrity, publicly deriding a Black woman on social media and receiving praise for it, it's just, again, these levels of insult to injury and these levels of underscoring the power dynamics, and ultimately where the empathy lies only with celebrities who happen to be predominantly rich white people. So Chris never gets any, his family doesn't get any justice, not even the hope for justice. And in fact, the book has been the one thing that they feel is some potential for them to say, hey, there's actually someone telling our story, and there's actually some proof here for us to say that not only did Chris exist, but his life mattered as well. And I compare his death to the death of this camera assistant who was roughly the same age as him, who was a white woman who died right around the same time as him under shockingly similar circumstances while she was working on a film, and Hollywood celebrated her. She was honored at the Oscars. They did a candlelight vigil for her in Hollywood. And really what separates them is this idea of paparazzi and who the paparazzi are, which is racialized and gendered, and the contrasting representation of people who conceptualize those who work on film sets as, class-wise, race-wise, different. And so I think that the Me Too movement and the Oscars So White movement, these mobilize and are important, but they certainly don't grasp the full scope of what we're dealing with in terms of abuses of power in Hollywood.
Well, and the objectification. You still have people who the magazines depend on, who
right.
are not employees of the magazines, don't get benefits, don't get paid, but exactly. You couldn't have the magazines without their work.
Exactly. Absolutely.
So I think of this as really a very pioneering ethnography. And, there You mentioned Sherry Ordner. There's the older Hortense Powdermaker book, but it's a pioneering ethnography in many, many ways. And I always feel like every book like that opens up a whole bunch of possibilities of books that need to be written. And I wonder if you have thoughts about like what somebody who's in graduate school or university now and thinking about like what projects really need to be done. What other ethnographies do you think could really be done to take what you've done and move it to a next place?
That's such a good question. I think that the possibilities are infinite, because I think that what we're seeing in this moment is the sort of infinite abuses of power and problematic nature of our power structures at every institutional level. So I actually think in the context of Hollywood, sure, there's work to be done there, but I think of the book as more on a sort of institutional level. And so I think that the work is more about, I feel like you and I have talked about this since the beginning of thinking about, Karen Ho's book on Wall Street, and thinking about these sort of these really important institutional politics in places that we think of in a particular way because they're public, right? Like people know the name Wall Street, people know the name Hollywood, but what's really happening behind those, not even necessarily closed doors, but just elite spaces that not everyone has access to. And what we see every time is that it's not what we think it is. That there's what is performed of these, right? There's Oscars night. There's these moments where we think we see what is really happening, but we don't actually understand the inner workings. And what we find is that when we look at the inner workings at any of these institutional forces, is that there's profound inequality, that there's profound racism, that there's profound sort of just systematic questions and problems that deserve addressing. And so I think it's, less about Hollywood and more about what I'm interested in seeing is how future work will just kind of continue to kind of look for the unexpected in these, in any kind of institutional space. I mean, one thing, I think about this all the time, but I may not be the one to get to this work first, is the celebrity of academia. That's something that I have thought about and sort of been reckoning with throughout the progress of this book, because those kinds of cultural politics are so profoundly felt in academia. And I think we see that come out. There's been a Me Too moment for academia, right, at various points. We have the constant reckoning and re-reckoning with anthropology and other disciplines. And I think that this question of abuse of power is also really prevalent in academia and has very much to do with this sort of idea of celebrity politics.
This is a really fine place to end, I think. And did you have anything that you wanted to add?
Just that I'm so happy that this book is finally out there, and it's been so many years and conversations in the making. And I hope that, the images help people to not just get the full visual scope, but allow them to be able to see the lens turned, back on the producers in a way that we don't always get to see. And I'm just really grateful for the opportunity to have this conversation and to have produced this book with your support.
And I'm really excited about it and recommend it highly. And thank you so much, Vanessa, for making time to talk about it today.
Of course. Thank you.